Let's begin. And I will tell you, because I've already gone over a little bit of this material. We introduced it in the back classroom last Wednesday night. So I'm not going to go over every slide that we talked about last Wednesday night, but I will go back and look at a few slides, and I'll tell you which slide in your book to look at. And if you look at your book, and by the way, if anybody needs a pen, I have pens here. So if you want a pen, Ron, would you be willing to pass the pens out to anybody that might want one? So if you notice your slides, there's 3 slides of the page. There's room where you can take some notes, because we'll mention some scriptures that might not be on the slides, and you may want to put those there. Also, if anybody does not have a binder, we'll get binders to you. We have plenty of binders here. Jerry, would you pass those out to anybody that still needs one? I think I've given them to most everybody. And let's see, Kathy and Betty, these are the rest of the slides for your binders.
Thank you.
Okay, so if you'll look at slide number 4, that's the next one we'll go to. And the question that we want to look at is, why study the subject of Christian evidences? And the reason being is because we're living in a world that appears to be drifting increasingly into deeper levels of unbelief. And quite honestly, our faith is under assault. And so we need to be prepared to address this. And if we don't do something about it, no one else will. The time has come for us to fortify our minds and with the kind of truth that can weather the attacks of unbelief. Let me just tell you why this is important for us to do things like this. This was published February 7th of this year. New research pinpoints how the torch passed from one dominant creature on earth to another, from the brutish dinosaur to the crafty mammal. 2 studies were published last Thursday. And they were published in the Journal of Science. Better explain the earth-shaking consequences of catastrophic cosmic collision 66 million years ago, when a comet or asteroid smashed into the Gulf of Mexico. The crash seemed to end the reign of the dinosaurs, and it gave way to the age of mammals that probably started with a cute squirrel-like critter and eventually led to us, the researchers report. So we're no longer from monkeys. That's a good thing. But the bad thing is, this cute squirrel-like critter was larger than a mouse, smaller than a rat, had a long tail and a long nose and sharp teeth. That's the picture that they show on the internet. Okay? They go on to say, I think it's fair to say, without the dinosaurs having gone extinct, we would not be here. Director of the Berkeley Geochronology Center, Paul Wren, made that statement. He led the research on the dinosaurs and cosmic crash, and the dinosaurs' disappearance essentially releases the little timid mammals to become the big guys. Wren demonstrated how the timing of the cosmic crash exquisitely matches the disappearance of the slow-footed dinosaurs of Jurassic Park fame. His findings provide more evidence for the theory of an extraterrestrial crash was most responsible for the extinction of dinosaurs. And he said that there were other environmental factors, such as a changing climate from volcanic eruptions. He went on to say the asteroid really rang the bell of the planet. And the second study painstakingly details the family tree of the most predominant type of mammal, those that give birth after a long gestation period. The researchers proposed that the first such mammal was a shrewish critter slightly bigger than a mouse with a nasty set of teeth, and it first popped in the world a little more than 65 million years ago, just after that cosmic crash. When an asteroid or comet hits Earth and kills all the dinosaurs, it's both a tragedy and an opportunity, says Maureen O'Leary of Stony Brook University and lead author of the mammal study. In some sense, we are a product of that opportunity. Isn't that amazing? And then finally it says, this isn't something that is just a guess. This is something that is a result of the analysis, O'Leary said. This thing had a long furry tail, talking about the creature. it had white underbelly, and it had brown eyes. Now, how can they determine this from a creature that was 65 million years old? The first mammal evolved over the years into all sorts of different types, eventually including bats, whales, elephants, and primates like us. Unlike the slow-witted dinosaurs, which weren't known for their ability to adapt, mammals in general are more intelligent and can adapt well, O'Leary said. These are the evolutionists, and I'm here to tell you that we deal with atheists all the time, and most atheists, I can go on record of saying that they are evolutionists. They don't believe in God, but they believe that something was created, and it was a spontaneous creation. We'll talk more about atheists a little bit later. But, so when we look at this, Christians and young need to be grounded in the true principles of biblical faith. We have some groups of people we need to address and find an answer for, and that's what we're going to try to do in this class. Agnosticism are those people who don't know whether there's a God or not. That's basically their comment. We just don't know. There may be and there may not. And of course the atheist. There's another group I didn't put on this slide that we will address in this class. And I would submit to you that there may be a few in this class that had this perception. The word theism comes from a Greek word, theos, which means God. If you know the word theology, what do you know? Huh?
The Bible, religion.
Religion, okay. Theos, God. Bible, study, God belief. Theologian, okay. All of these come from that Greek word. Theism, then, you and I are theistic in nature. But there are a group of people that we call theistic evolutionists. Why?
They believe God started it all, but that
Raise your hand so they can bring the mic to you so we can hear. Remember, we're recording this. I don't mean to be mean, but in all fairness, so it can be recorded properly.
they believe God started it all, but that it took off and it has evolved from there.
Okay. All right. Anybody want to add to that? We sometimes use scriptures such as 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 8, where it says, "But beloved, be not ignorant of this one thing, that one day is with the Lord as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is one day." And so when we get to Genesis chapter 1 and chapter 2, the first thing we think about is, well, just because he says the evening and the morning was the first day, the evening and morning was the second day, we think that, well, maybe there was 1,000 years in between each one of those days. Because time means nothing to God. We look at things like Matthew 24, verse 36. It says, "But of that day and hour knoweth no man, no, not the angels of heaven, but my Father only." So when you're studying with someone that has that philosophy, that with this 6 days of creation, to support the argument of dinosaurs being millions of years old, well, maybe the earth is millions of years old. We are going to address the age of the earth later on in this class. Excuse me. But if you will, get your Bibles and turn to Exodus, the 20th chapter. And we're going to put this theistic evolutionist to rest right now. Exodus, the 20th chapter. This is where Moses has gone up on Mount Sinai. He's spoken with God. The 10 Commandments are about to be given and everything. God has told Moses to come back down and speak to the people. And in verse 1 he says, "And God spoke all these words, saying," okay? Now go down to verse 9. "6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall do no work. You, nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your male servant, nor your female servant, nor your cattle, nor your stranger who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth. Now he's talking to the children of Israel, and he tells them 6 days they shall work, and on the Sabbath they shall not work. And then he goes on and he says, in 6 days he made the heavens and the earth. Now, if we're going to be consistent with the Scriptures, that pretty well tells us that a day is a 24-hour day. Now, nowhere in the Scriptures will you see the phrase 24 hours. That's something man created. But as we look at this study and everything, we'll see that the earth in its rotation and everything, that all of this was figured out. And God planned this from the very beginning. But when you're talking to evolutionists and when you're talking to atheists, you can't use the Scriptures, as Ron mentioned Sunday morning, and that's where I got in trouble because I should have heard the sermon before I made my comments. Had I heard the sermon before I made my comments, my class would still be back there probably. But I'm glad that there's some interest in this study because I think it is a good study for all of us. And I think we'll all be better for it. And because of it, we'll be better able to talk with these individuals. So, with that said, let's go to slide 7, if you will. In slide 7, the question is, why do men believe as they do? Any thoughts? Why do people believe as they do, or the way they do? Kathy, did I see your hand?
Page 3.
Oh, page 3 in your book. In everybody's book, yes. Slide 7. Well, the first thing, we need to recognize that there are some arguments that have been made, have been offered in its support as to why that they believe the way they do. And I just read 2 studies that was just published on the 7th of this month. And it was encountered in a book or paper, and nothing was spoken against it. And then there's common belief in one's culture and environment. The new belief fits well with our prior beliefs, is why some men believe the way that they do. And then, of course, there's the idea that there may be penalties for not accepting the belief, such as social ostracism, disappointment to parents, torture, etc., etc. And then finally, a belief is accepted because it gratifies us or answers a psychological need. But I would submit to you that there's one other reason why people believe the way they do. And that reason is it is a mark of intellectual sophistication. Intellectual sophistication. What that simply means is I know better than you do. I know better than God does. Nobody can tell me different because I've seen the evidence. I watched the Discovery Channel. I know that the earth is 65 million years old. I see some of these sitcoms that suggest evolution as well. There's one sitcom on Thursday night, The Big Bang Theory, if you watch the introduction of it and everything. Obviously, it was the Big Bang, which is exactly what these 2 studies are talking about. And yes, did I hear? Oh. The baby has a comment. Yes, Jared.
1 Corinthians, starting in chapter 1, verse 18, talks about the wisdom of God, and you make men foolish as a result of not being able to accept His wisdom. So I think a lot of people that say, well, the age of the earth is this and this and this. I go back to this chapter to look at this chapter because he's going to make men think I'm smarter than this, but he said he would do this, so
Yeah.
It doesn't surprise me very much.
And I would agree with you if you're studying with a theistic evolutionist that you might get by with that. But if you're talking with an evolutionist or an atheist, you're not going to get by with showing them that scripture because they don't believe it anyway. So we have to come up with some other proofs, some other ways to demonstrate to these people that they're wrong. So these individuals, I might say, they contend that faith ought to be relegated to the realm of superstition. And others, though not approaching this extreme, feel that faith to a certain degree cannot be proven. Okay? And it's our job as Christians to be able to take a stand and be able to present this. So, slide number 8. What does God accept? First off, if you look at 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 21, and you don't need to look at the verse, what it says is, test all things, hold fast what is good. Okay? So we definitely have a commandment here from God that you and I should test all things. And in these studies, we will show that there is ample evidence to demonstrate that God is, and that He is a rewarder of them who seek after Him. If you look at Hebrews the 11th chapter, verse 6, if you want to turn there real quick, and we'll read that verse, Hebrews 11, verse 6. The Hebrew writer says, "But without faith it is impossible to please Him, for he who comes to God must believe that He is, and that He is a rewarder of those who diligently seek Him." You and I have faith. The atheist also has faith, but not the same faith that you have. And if you talk to an atheist, if any of you saw the Channel 5 news report last week, the atheist will tell you, I'm just looking for someone to show me, to prove to me that God exists. And the one they interviewed went on to say, most religions are not able to prove that God exists. I found that interesting when he said most religions, because I would like to talk to the individual that was on that and ask him, well, have you found a few religions that have planted a seed of doubt in your mind? Those of you who are old enough to know W.C. Fields, and I mentioned this to my class last week, W.C. Fields was a very well-known atheist. And I don't know how true it is, but it's said that when W.C. Fields was on his deathbed, his grandson came in and saw him reading the Bible and asked his grandfather what he was doing. And if you can imagine W.C. Fields' humor, he said to his grandson, he said, I'm looking for loopholes. I'm looking for loopholes. Even the atheist will come to a point sometime in their life when they will begin to believe. But I will tell you this, atheists do believe in something. It isn't God, but they do believe in something. So, look at slide 9, if you will. How does the atheist explain? Since the unbeliever does not believe, let me put that up so you see it, okay? Since the unbeliever does not believe that there is an eternal mind with which goodness is coexistent, an intrinsically moral being, obviously, he must contend that somehow raw, eternal, inorganic matter was able, by means of an extended evolutionary process, to concoct, promote, and maintain morality. Okay? So, when we look at the word atheist, well, that, okay, it does show up there. It doesn't show up back there very well. The word atheist, from a, not, and theos, God, not God, confidently asserts that there is no God. Skeptic, they are skeptic, not quite so bold, simply doubts the existence of a supreme being. So they're atheists, but some are skeptics. They just have a doubt. But then there's the agnostic, as we mentioned. They argue that there is not sufficient evidence to establish a case for the existence of God. Hence, the agnostic affirms that one cannot know whether or not there is a God. And then there's the deist. The deist theoretically acknowledges the existence of a supreme creator, but this God has no interest in or contact with man. No interest in or contact with man. Look at Romans, the first chapter, in verse 28. Romans 1 and verse 28. While you're turning there, what I want you to see about these philosophies is that each one of them is deadly wrong and can only lead to eternal ruin or condemnation. Those who subscribe to such views have, for various reasons, forced the evidence for God's existence from their minds, for as we shall presently show, unbelief is not natural. Unbelief is not natural. Everybody believes in something. Rather, it forces reason aside to capture the mind. And Paul said to the church at Rome in Romans 1:28 says, "And even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, God gave them over to a debased mind to do those things which are not fitting." Okay? Now let's look at slide 12, if you will. So when we look at rational and irrational belief, rational and irrational belief. Irrational belief is based upon several things. Anybody have any idea what it might be based on? Do what, Kathy?
Logic.
Logic. Okay. Do what? Scientific testing. Okay. Experience. Now we're talking about irrational belief, not rational. Now we'll talk about rational in just a minute. But what y'all said is good for rational belief, okay? Irrational belief.
Feelings.
Huh?
Feelings, emotions.
Feeling, emotions, gullible. Emotion certainly is up there. Prejudice, irrational belief. Vested interest. They may have a vested interest in the stand that they're taking. Certainly it's habit, force of habit. Gullible. All of these. And then finally, inadequate reasons is certainly a part of irrational belief. Okay? But what about rational belief? If you look at slide number 13, rational belief. Rational belief is based on a number of things, but if you look at Isaiah, the 41st chapter, verse 21, it says, "Present your case, says the Lord, bring forth your strong reasons, says the King of Jacob." And if you look at Philippians, the 1st chapter, verse 7, "Just as it is right for me to think this of you all, because I have you in my heart, inasmuch as both in my chains and in the defense and confirmation of the gospel, you all are partakers with me of grace." And then we look at what Paul said to the church at Thessalonica in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 21. It says, "Test all things, hold fast what is good." And then 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 15, "But sanctify the Lord God in your hearts, and always be ready to give a defense to everyone who asks you a reason for the hope that is in you with meekness and fear." This is rational belief is based on reason then. So, we look at some important issues that we have to address in this class then. And the first issue that we must address is, how did we get here? Everybody here, we know how we got here, or we wouldn't be here tonight. But how would you address the individual that you're talking to that asked that question? Especially if they don't believe in God. And we have to be able to do that. The existence of God. How can we prove that God exists? Is there a resurrection of the dead? How can we show that? And is the Bible reliable and inerrant? Is it consistent? There are only 20 verses throughout all the Bible that the theistic man questions as far as possible accuracy. Only 20 verses. Now you think how many verses there are in the Bible. That means that believers of God accept the Bible as it's written. And we should. We should also be able to address, is Jesus the Son of God? And finally, the big question is, why are we Christians? Why are we Christians? And how can we address that? What would we say to an individual that would help them have an open heart and receive the truth? So, the need to believe then, if God is the ground of all existence, and if He is the one in whom we live, move, and have our very being, it is only reasonable to conclude that mankind would have a basic need to believe in Him. For in Acts 17, verse 28, if you want to turn there, Acts 17, verse 28. says, "For in him we live and move and have our being, as also some of your own poets have said, for we are also his offspring." All right, with that said then, let's ask this question. Look at slide 16, if you will. And the question is, why do people turn to atheism? This individual that they interviewed last week admitted that he grew up going to worship service. I suspect it's Baptist. I'm not sure of that because he never did say what religion he went to. But he grew up with a family that took him to worship service, every service, hearing God, whether it be accurate or inaccurate. He heard God and he read the Bible, whether it be accurate or inaccurate as far as their interpretation of the Bible. But the fact is, why did he turn to atheism? And we have young people today that do that very thing. We have young people today that when they grow up and they leave home, they no longer believe in God. They no longer take God serious. And some become theistic evolutionists. And I'm here to tell you that that has happened in this congregation. And maybe you know some. I mean, some of you have been in this congregation a lot longer than I have, and I don't know everybody that's come and gone. But you know some of the reasons why some have come and gone. You know some of the reasons why some of our young people grew up, and when they grew up and they were on their own, no longer came to worship service. No longer had that faith that you have. Why? Well, here's the problem. The seeds of atheism can be planted very early. Very early in life. One of the most dangerous contributions a parent can make toward the spiritual delinquency of his child is a failure to instill with him a wholesome respect for authority. A wholesome respect for authority. You remember that, and think about the world news the other day where this 18-year-old girl made an obscene gesture to the judge, and what happened? She learned to respect authority. She should have learned that from her parents. Now, sad to say, because of our economy and everything, parents basically have to be two-income families. Wish it wasn't so, and understand that it is so. And that creates a lot more burden on the parents because they have to make a commitment that when they do get home from work and they do spend time with their children, they give it 100% of the effort of spending quality time with the child, even though they may be tired. And this is the only way that they're going to help that child learn to respect authority. If the parent neglects to set the proper example as an authority figure or refuses to exercise discipline with love, he or she may be rejected as an authority figure by the child, and thus by transference the child may ultimately come to disdain all authority, including the supreme authority, God. If you heard the news tonight, Elk City, Oklahoma, 26-year-old man killed his mother. Why? Don't know. He could be mentally unstable. Don't know. But there was a lack of respect for authority somewhere there. And we see that all the time. So that's the first thing. But the second reason why people turn to atheism is inordinate pride facilitates atheism. This disposition sees man as his own God, hence he will submit to no one else. As evolutionist George Gaylord Simpson wrote, "Man is his own master. He can and must decide his own destiny." This was published in the Life of the Past, Yale University Press, New Haven, Connecticut, in 1953. Friedrich Nietzsche, atheistic philosopher who made such an impact upon Hitler, once said, "If there were no gods, how could I endure it to be no God?" So, we have inordinate pride facilitates atheism. The third reason is to be free of moral responsibility. In Psalms 14:1, you don't need to turn there, it's a short verse, he says, "The fool has said in his heart, there is no God." Certainly the psalmist pinpointed why men reject the belief in God in order to be free of moral responsibility. And fourth, their faith is someone who professes to be a devout believer in God has been shattered. That's the impact you and I have on people around us. That's why every day, part of our prayer should be that as we go through this day, we should be an example to others that they might see Christ in us through our words and our actions, because we might shatter the faith of someone and they might turn to atheism. Sometimes this happens because their faith in someone who professes to be a devout believer in God has been shattered. Proverbs 25 verse 19. Turn there if you will. And then we'll look at Psalms 118 verse 8. Proverbs 25 verse 19. The proverb writer says, "Confidence in an unfaithful man in time of trouble is like a broken tooth and a foot out of joint." A foot out of joint. It is folly to blame deity for the blunders of man. And when we look at what the psalmist said in Psalms 118 verse 8, excuse me, he says, "It is better to trust in the Lord than to put confidence in man." Better to trust in the Lord than to put confidence in man. Well, okay. So these are the reasons why people turn to atheism. But there is an excuse that the atheist makes. And this brings us to some new material that my class has not even had, because this is where we stopped last Wednesday night. And we'll try to address this problem of suffering in the next 10 minutes. Excuse me. With many people, the great obstacle to belief in God is the problem of evil and suffering. The problem of evil and suffering, because men cannot subject all suffering to meaningful analysis. The assumption is sometimes made that there cannot exist a loving God such as the Bible describes if we are going to have suffering. The problem is presented by the Greek philosopher Epicurus is this. And he said, if God wishes to prevent evil but cannot, then he is not all-powerful. If he can prevent evil but will not, then he is not good. And if he has both the power and will to eliminate evil, then why is evil in the world? Why is evil in the world? Men cannot subject all suffering to meaningful analysis, as I mentioned. And we want to look at Romans 11, verse 33 in just a minute, so be turning there. The fallacy of the argument is the assumption that no good purpose can be served by the allowance of evil and suffering in the world. No one would be so presumptuous as to assert that man can completely understand the problem of suffering. Other than what he has revealed in his word, the mind and purposes of God are unknown to man. And when we see what Paul said to the church at Rome in Romans the 11th chapter verse 33, it says, "Oh, the depth of the riches, both of the wisdom and knowledge of God, how unsearchable are his judgments and his ways past finding out." Enough of the answers are suggested in the Bible. However, to allow us to accept the inexplicable percentage on the basis of faith, trusting in the loving God who always does what is right, in Genesis 18 verse 25, we read this. "Far be it from you to do such a thing as this, to slay the righteous with the wicked, so that the righteous should be as the wicked. Far be it from you, shall not the judge of all the earth do right?" We need to understand that God is love. And so let's observe the following, first off. Let it be noted that when one raises the question of evil, he is appealing to some universal system of justice which evil allegedly violates. Evil allegedly violates. But if there is no God, hence no universal system of rightness, how could there be any evil? Does not the word suggest the violation of some standard? And actually, therefore, no atheist can, consistent with his own philosophy, even introduce the problem of evil. The second thing we need to... Somebody have a comment? Second thing we need to appreciate is, let us introduce the following argument with which we will expand upon. First, love allows freedom of choice. Does it not? You and I have freedom of choice. To do good, to do evil, to do whatever we want to do. Could anyone conceive of a loving God who created intelligent beings but then programmed them to slavishly serve Him without a personal will? What kind of God would that be? In John 4, verse 8, I ask you to turn there, tells us God is love. For it says, he who does not love does not know God, for God is love. But then verse 16 of John 4, or 1 John, I said John, 1 John, like John says, look at the chart back here. And we have known and believed the love that God has for us. God is love, and he who abides in love abides in God, and God in him. Thus, God does allow freedom of choice. So, obviously, where there is freedom of choice, there is the possibility that finite beings will make wrong choices then, won't we? But wrong choices can entail evil and suffering. If all choices, both good and bad, produce the same effect, how would one ever learn to choose the former and reject the latter? Thus, where there is freedom of choice, there is the inevitable consequence that finite beings must be allowed to suffer the consequences of their choices. So, let's see if we can't look at some types of suffering in the world. Types of suffering in the world. First off, we suffer due to our personal wrong choices. And this is frequently suffering due to our personal wrong choices. 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 15 says, "But let none of you suffer as a murderer, a thief, an evildoer, or as a busybody in other man's or other people's matters." And much suffering is a consequence of other people's freedom of choice. And we all covet freedom of choice and yet deny it to everyone else. Isn't that what happens in our government system today? Yeah, we don't like to see people killed with guns, and I'm not going to stand here and tell you whether I advocate gun control or not. But I am going to tell you that I do not think the federal government should be mandating the freedom of choice. I think that we should make sure that we do the appropriate thing to make sure that the criminals and those who are mentally unstable do not have access to the same things. And yet, when we look at our justice system and we still release people from prison that should not be released, we find that people who are on the records as a molester are living where they should not be living. All of these things, if you think about all the laws that we have in our system, we really only need 10 laws. God was perfect in the 10 Commandments. And if we followed the 10 Commandments, we wouldn't need all these other amendments and laws, would we? And all of the 10 Commandments, for the most part, with the exception of one, we can find in the New Testament, can't we? So God has given the perfect system, but the fact is there is this problem here, this suffering that we have. So,
Man's been trying to make too many loopholes.
do what?
I said that.
Oh, John stepped out of the... Jimmy will get it real quick.
I just said they tried to make too many loopholes.
Well, they do. They try to make too many loopholes. They try to make it... I mean, this is just my opinion. I don't want to get on a political deal here, but I do have a problem when the people that we put in office to represent us will pass laws and exempt themselves from the laws. If they're that bad, they shouldn't be passing the law. So that's just my personal opinion. So that's enough said. That was the second bell, so we're going to have to stop here. We'll continue this next week.